Good morning. I am delighted to be here, and I feel especially honored to be the initial speaker in a week-long celebration about women. Before I launch into the main thrust of my presentation this morning, I would like very much to spend a couple of minutes talking about a group of women with whom I work and who play a very important role in the success of the Historical Society. There are two main sources of revenue that keep the place operating. One is membership fees. People like you who join the society and pay a yearly membership fee provide part of the funding, and the other important part comes from the admissions fees that are collected from visitors to the house. When a visitor comes to the door, he is shown through the house on a one-to-one basis by a group of women who are volunteers, and these are the guides that operate the mansion. Over the years, since the first part of this century, when the house was first opened to the public, the volunteers have played an important role in the society's function. Ladies who form the Ladies' Committee and raise funds, ladies who do the work of the House Committee, making sure that the things in the rooms are set up as prettily as possible. All of these volunteers are extremely important, and I wonder what's going to happen in a few years when, by necessity, most families will require a woman to work at a paying job, thus cutting down her hours of volunteer labor. It's going to make things very difficult indeed. I recently was involved with a group of visitors. They were newly appointed diplomats from foreign nations to be stationed in Washington. Gail Hercher from the Peabody Museum in Salem called and wanted to know if, in conjunction with the Peabody, they could have the group come through the Lee Mansion. Of course, we were delighted to be included with this. This is rather a crash course in American culture and history for new visitors, foreign visitors to the country who will be stationed here for a while. And it's sponsored by the Executive Council on Foreign Diplomats in America. One of the things that Gail found very interesting was the disbelief of many of these people in the fact that the ladies who were doing the guiding at both the Peabody and at the Lee Mansion were volunteers. This particular thing seems to be an American phenomenon, and I'm afraid, of necessity in many cases, it is beginning to dwindle. Now let's talk about Marblehead women in history. We're going to cover 3 centuries, and we'll cover a witch and a wench, a librarian and a rosarian, an heiress, a preacher, and a slave. Not necessarily in that order. In the 17th century, when this country was being settled, the people who came here brought with them not only their hopes and dreams and their best pots and pans, but they brought along with them a very firm belief in witchcraft. And in 1692, in Danvers, Massachusetts, in a town then called Salem Village, for a period of about 9 months, a witch hunt was being carried on, during which men and women, primarily women, were accused of being witches. Many of them were executed, and this unfortunate situation was a sort of mass hysteria, I guess, but it affected Marblehead particularly with Mrs. Samuel Redd. She was the wife of a Marblehead fisherman and probably had never been out of town in her life. But in May of 1692, a gentleman from Salem came over and accused poor Mammy Redd of causing grievous suffering to 3 young girls in Salem Village. She protested her innocence and maintained throughout the trial that she didn't know what in the world they were talking about. Perhaps the whole thing started because she was not the most pleasant of people, but however, a cranky disposition doesn't necessarily mean that one is a witch, thank goodness. Mrs. Redd was tried, found guilty, and was hanged in Salem in September of 1692. It's curious to notice that in the general amnesty that followed the witchcraft trials, Mrs. Red's name doesn't appear anywhere, nor does it appear that her husband ever paid her bill for board at Salem jail. He didn't appear against her, nor did he appear for her at her trial. He's rather a shadowy figure at best, but the poor soul went to her grave being accused of being a witch. There was one other woman in Marblehead who was accused of witchcraft. Her name was Mrs. Erasmus James, but in her case, she did quite well. She sued the people who accused her for libel, and she won her case. Things were slightly different in the 18th century. Just prior to the Revolutionary War, one Samuel Tucker, who owned a number of slaves, decided that he would free his slaves before he went off to fight in the Revolution, and two of them were called Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Brown. Black Joe was part Negro and part Gayhead Indian, and his wife was all black. Black Joe went off to fight with his former owner, and after the Revolutionary War, he came back, and he and Aunt Crease started a tavern up on the top of Gingerbread Hill. They were quite popular, evidently, during the election period, when great parties and celebrations would be held. Elections at that time were held in May, and you could hear the sounds of the fiddle and the noise of dancing feet and great jovial noises coming out of Black Joe's tavern. Aunt Crease used to bake election cakes and election buns. It was a kind of heavily fruited confection that would last. It could be put out on a table, and for people who came and went, they could help themselves. It wouldn't go stale in the interim. Black Joe's Tavern stands, by the way. It's a delightful salt box on the top of Gingerbread Hill, behind which sits a pond which still bears Black Joe's name, and it's a marvelous pond in the early winter because it's shallow and it freezes quickly, and the children have a great time up there skating. Nearby was another tavern owned by a woman whose name was Auntie Bowen. She earned the sobriquet Ma'am Sociable. I'll leave that to your imagination. She wasn't terribly sociable to the children, who used to walk through the garden and steal her apples, however. And now we come to another woman of the 18th century who would make a wonderful heroine for a Barbara Cartland novel. This tale has everything: an unlettered wench, a titled English gentleman, foreign travel, all the things that make a wonderful romantic novel. The year is 1742, and our hero is a young man of 26 who is the collector for the Port of Boston. His name is Charles Henry Frankland. And as collector of the port, one of his duties is to come to supervise the erection of a fort at the mouth of Marblehead Harbor. Because he's in town for a period of time, he spends the evening, or the night, I should say, at a nearby hostelry named the Fountain Inn, and there he espies a comely lass. She is barefoot and in rags, but gorgeous nonetheless, and totally unlettered. Young Harry speaks to her and finds out that her name is Agnes Surridge, the daughter of a poor but honest fisherman. Harry is quite taken with Agnes and decides that perhaps she should become his ward. He would take her to Boston and teach her the ways of a young gentlewoman. She would learn sewing and deportment, a little music, a little social conversation. Of course, this has to be cleared with Agnes's parents. So he proposes this idea to them, and they seem amenable. Of course, they had to discuss it with the family preacher, and he again was amenable, so off Agnes goes, she 16 and young Harry 26. When they first arrive in Boston, it's a novelty, and the Boston society finds it quite appealing. But after a while, tongues begin to wag. The gossip begins to get rather difficult to live with. So Harry goes off to Hopkinton and buys a plot of land of about 480 acres. Now, this is going to guarantee a certain amount of privacy, I should think. He also builds rather a fancy house there, elaborate mansion, and he sets up some quite interesting gardens. He was a fine amateur gardener, and Agnes shared his love for gardening, incidentally. But about 1753, Harry learns that he has become Sir Harry Frankland. A relative in England has died and left him not only a title but an estate in Yorkshire. And back they go to England for business purposes in 1753. And Agnes, of course, is not accepted by Harry's very stuffy English family. Again, to avoid some of the difficulties, Harry decides to take Agnes on a grand tour of the continent. Not only does it get him away from the uncomfortable situation at home, but it probably would serve to round off any of Agnes's rough corners, if there any existed at that point. By 1755, they found themselves in Lisbon. They took a house there, and this is not the best time to be in Portugal, because Lisbon is about to be hit by a gigantic, cataclysmic earthquake. Now, one of the accounts I read doing the research on this was rather interesting because it mentioned another woman. I hope Barbara Cartland is listening. Harry went out in a carriage with another woman, according to the account, to oversee the construction of a church. Agnes was left in the rooms, and when Harry did not return after the earthquake, she took it upon herself to go out and try and find him. The account read that the woman was so upset by the earthquake that she bit right through Harry's sleeve. Well, at any rate, Agnes found them and dug out the carriage and saved her love. Didn't say anything about the other woman, but we shall give Agnes the benefit of the doubt. Our stalwart heroine doubtless freed both of them. She nursed Sir Harry back to health, and he decided it was about time to make an honest woman of her. So in Spain they were married by a Catholic priest, and on the way back to England they were married again aboard ship by an Anglican minister. Harry's health began to fade. But they came back to this country and lived for a while on their estate in Hopkinton, where they spent a good deal of time on the gardens. But as Harry got more and more ill, and the revolution was getting closer, and both of them were Tories, it was time for them to return to England. Sir Harry died, and about 2 years later, Agnes married again, a very wealthy banker from Chichester. She only lived 2 years beyond that. She died at age 57. At the Lee Mansion, we have a coverlet. I don't know if it was made by Agnes, but at least it would belong to her, and it's a lovely green quilt that we have in our collection. The next lady of the 18th century has a perfectly delightful name, Mehitable Pedrick. Now, Mehitable Pedrick was a Marblehead lady, young girl, as a matter of fact. In 1770, Dr. Elisha Story, a widower from Boston, moved to Marblehead with his 7 children. Dr. Story was rather an interesting man. One, he was one of the Indians at the Boston Tea Party, and he also became involved later on in the smallpox war. There was an inoculation available to save people from the scourge of smallpox, but it was most unpopular, and any forward-thinking gentleman like Dr. Story was bound to create a certain amount of flack wherever he went when espousing his cause. However, when he came to Marblehead, he met young Mehitable, and they were married when she was age 19. Now, can you imagine at 19 taking on 7 children at one crack, and then proceeding to have 11 more for a grand total of 18? Mehitable's firstborn turned out to be the American Blackstone, so called by the British because he was Joseph Story, a justice of the United States Supreme Court, and greatly revered on both sides of the Atlantic for his knowledge of the law and his special abilities to forge treaties that were fair and equitable for everyone. He was a learned gentleman and greatly thought of by everyone. When Dr. Elisha Story died, he left a very interesting tribute to Mehetabel in his will. It's not a particularly romantic tribute, but it does show the great respect that he felt for her, and I shall read it verbatim. He refers to her in his will as, quote, "my beloved, faithful, and affectionate wife, who did, during the whole time in which I have lived most happily with her, take on the charge and management of my children whom I had by a former wife, and did conduct that trust reposed in her with great patience and prudence which probably have few examples, and thereby left my mind free to prosecute my professional engagements." In the 19th century, women took on a slightly different flavor. We began to get women who were people in their own right rather than being adjuncts of someone else. And we come upon Mary Alley. I am invariably asked by someone, am I a native Marbleheader? And my answer quite proudly is yes, I was born at the Mary Alley on Franklin Street. I usually get rather a puzzled look because that's a peculiar name for a hospital, and why the differentiation of Franklin Street? Mary Alley was a Marblehead school teacher. That was her basic profession, but she also was a businesswoman. She worked very closely with her uncle in his business affairs. She kept his books and helped him with business decisions. And she had such acumen and such a head for business that her uncle felt very well disposed toward her and left her a house on Franklin Street. During her lifetime, Miss Alley developed a great social conscience. She was very much aware of the suffering and sickness around her and no way of taking care of people. She herself went around town in a carriage bringing food and medicine to people who were ill, and for the ones who were particularly sick, she brought them into her own home and saw that they were cared for as best she could. She was secretary to the Soldiers' Aid during the Civil War. She was co-founder of the Marblehead Visiting Nurse Association, and she was also a board member of the Marblehead Female Humane Society. More about that in a minute. When she died, she left to the town the house she had received from her uncle on Franklin Street and a sum of money with the idea that a hospital would be set up for the people of Marblehead. I can remember a number of years later, a good number of years later, when the talk came up at town meeting to build a new hospital. Now, what are we going to call this? Are we going to call it by that peculiar name? There was a good deal of discussion about it, but it was finally decided that it would indeed be the Mary Alley Hospital, and her portrait hangs in the lobby, a rather stern-looking woman with an Empress Eugenie hairdo. I also remember the great flap that went on at a subsequent town meeting when it was decided to close the maternity ward at the new Mary Alley because of economic reasons, and that no longer would babies be born in Marblehead. They would be born in Salem Hospital. Now the question arose, would they be Marbleheaders? And there was a good deal of discussion about that at the time, as I remember. I mentioned the Marblehead Female Humane Society. Now this sounds like something to do with cats, but what it is an old lady's home, and it is located on the corner of Harris and Mugford Street. It was begun in 1816, and I think the most delightful, interesting thing about it is that when it was founded in 1816, the dues were 10 cents a month, and they are the same in 1983. When Marbleheaders get together, they are wont to break into song, and the song that's usually sung is Marblehead Forever. Now, the lyrics to this are rather interesting. The song goes, "Marblehead forever, God bless the dear old town. May she never shed her noble ancestry. She was first in Revolution, first in 61, and from whiskey bondage we will keep her free." Now, that's rather an interesting line, and it was written by a woman who was a preacher. Her name was Marcia Martin Selman. She was born in 1856, and she was educated in Marblehead. And as many women did in those days, she became a teacher. She graduated from State Normal School in Salem and taught school in Marblehead. She was an avid member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And evidently, Marbleheaders have never been ones to suffer thirst kindly. There have always been taverns and places known as watering holes around town. And in 1884 and 1887, there was a tremendous movement everywhere for temperance. At that period in Marblehead, with a small population, there were some 84 licensed saloons and innumerable unlicensed places where one could get a drink. So Miss Selman was called upon to write this rallying song to forward the cause of the Temperance Union. After Marcia Selman's mother died, she decided to fulfill a lifelong ambition, and at age 40 in 1896, she graduated from Tufts Theological School. Her first ministry was in Mechanic Falls, Maine, and then she came to Marblehead and became the pastor of the Universalist Church. The old church still stands on the corner of Watson and Pleasant Street. It's now where the Gut and Feathers Club is, but it's rather a marvelous edifice. And in the Society's collection, we have a delightful little gold watch. The face is trimmed with pearls that was presented to Marcia Selman by her grateful parishioners. While I was doing the research for this talk today, I also came across a delightful picture in the paper of one Sarah E. Gregory, widow. Now, this lady was pictured in the paper in 1929 in a rather severe bonnet and an unadorned dress. And the caption under the picture said that she was age 83 and just beginning her 50th year as librarian at the Abbott Public Library. It seemed that Mrs. Gregory had been widowed at age 30, and since there weren't many professions open to women at that time, she became the town librarian, and she served there for over 50 years. Now, as we get into the 20th century, we're going to get a couple of women that I remember. One of them was Harriet Risley Foote, and she was one of the foremost Rosarians in this country. She was the widow of the rector of St. Michael's Church, the Reverend Henry Foote, and when he was rector of the church, she had rather an elaborate rose garden in the rectory, at the rectory. The garden contained approximately 650 varieties of roses. After her husband's death, she moved to Devereux and Beach Streets and bought an enormous Victorian house on the corner with a fairly substantial piece of land. And there she started another rose garden. In 1947, at that garden on Beach Street, there were 12,000 varieties of roses. This was a period in this country when nurserymen were not importing roses. They were using the strains that had been in this country for a number of years. But she started to import and became the nation's leading foremost rose expert. Her reputation reached the ears of Henry Ford, who was starting a rose garden of his own in Dearborn, Michigan. And as a matter of fact, as early as the 1920s, she went out there to help him set up his gardens. He paid her portal to portal, $25 an hour from Marblehead to Dearborn and back, which is a fairly substantial sum in those days. But I can remember of a summer morning going over to Mrs. Foot's garden. It was immaculately kept. The garden pathways were always raked, and all the faded blossoms were picked off by Mrs. Foot and her assistant, Miss Sullivan. Tour buses, by the thousands it seemed, used to come and park, and the people would get out and go through the garden at no cost. She had everything, climbers, hybrid tea roses, miniature roses, everything immaculately kept, and oh, what a lovely smell with all those marvelous roses on a June morning. She felt that she could never sell a rose, that they were God's gifts and they should not be for commercial gain. I also remember Louise DuPont Crowninshield. Louise DuPont was born in Delaware in 1877. She was the daughter of Henry DuPont of the munitions family, and she and her brother Henry Francis were both educated at home. Neither of them had formal schooling. At a time when debutantes took the grand tour of Europe, Louise did not. She was trained in philanthropy from an early age, and had a wide variety of interests. Her mother had a summer home in Marblehead, and young Louise met the man she was going to marry here in Marblehead. Her husband was Francis B. Crowninshield, the Crowninshield family being very famous in Salem history as a seafaring family. It was Francis B. Crownenshield's great-great-uncle George who was the owner and builder of the first private yacht in America called Cleopatra's Barge. When Francis Crowninshield and Louise were married, they set up housekeeping in Boston and in a house on Marlborough Street. Louise began some charitable work in Boston, and then she and her husband also had a house in Marblehead. It was the custom of the time to have a number of houses up and down the seaboard, and Mr. and Mrs. Crowninshield moved from Boston as far south as Boca Grande as the seasons changed. The house in Marblehead was called Seaside Farm, and it was a great old-fashioned Victorian cottage perched on the rocks overlooking Grace Oliver's beach. The house had large rooms with tall ceilings, and the ocean breezes would blow through. It was rather beautiful, but of course not very efficient. The kitchen was in the basement, and it was presented quite a job to get hot food up to the dining room without having it cool off. The gardens around the house were spectacular. Lots of terraces and walkways, everything kept immaculately. Chinese vases planted with flowers were around the area, pools, great swimming pool, and it was just a glorious house for spending the summer. Mr. and Mrs. Crowninshield never had children, but they were awfully interested in having as many of their nieces and nephews come to visit as was possible. And the house resounded to children's laughter and the barking of dogs. Mrs. Crowninshield was very fond of poodles, particularly. It was a lively place, and Mrs. Crowninshield was most hospitable. She also became very interested in the various museums and historical houses in the immediate vicinity of Marblehead. She became involved at the Essex Institute in Salem along with the Peabody Museum, and she also started to work with the Marblehead Historical Society. Of course, she met with a great deal of resistance in the beginning. The Marblehead people were not terribly interested in having a summer person tell them that possibly the museum could stand a few alterations. Fortunately, Mrs. Crowninshield was a woman of great determination, and along with her good taste, discernment, etc., and her great generosity, of course, she prevailed. And the house, that as we see it today, is pretty much the way she envisioned it should be. A beautiful home of a wealthy man of the 18th century. When I was doing research for this talk, I was reading a small book written by Walter Muir Whitehill, in which he described Mrs. Crownshield's uncanny ability to redo a room in her head. She would think about the decorations in the room and the items and their placement and redesign it so that when the day actually came for the work to be done, she would set a chair in the middle of her room, and she would call Henry Barry, her long-suffering chauffeur, in, and she would start issuing instructions. In a very few minutes, the room was in chaos, but Mrs. Crowninshield knew exactly where everything was going to go, where it was going to be replaced, what pieces were going to go out of the room, what new pieces were going to come in, and in very short order, that room was transformed into something that was particularly beautiful and totally right. My first memories of Mrs. Crowninshield were at St. Michael's Church. She would be driven up in a woody. Now, that's an old Ford station wagon with the body being made out entirely of wood, and Mr. Barry, the chauffeur, kept it in apple pie order, and it was absolutely immaculate. There was invariably a poodle somewhere in the car, but the poodle stayed in the woody while Mr. Barry and a maid got Mrs. Crowninshield into church. She was a large woman, not terribly prepossessing, but certainly dignified, with a presence. And she wore rather flowing chiffon dresses with large collars coming down to the elbow. The pews at St. Michael's are very narrow, and they are attained through a very narrow door. It took a bit of doing to get her into the pew, but there she sat and enjoyed the service with the rest of us in a hot, small 18th century church on a Sunday morning. Of course, I was all full of giggles and wonder watching this woman come in. It was rather a production. Little did I know that this woman was great a lady, as I learned she was in later life. That stinks. When I was a youngster, Marblehead was more of a summer colony than it is now, and the house that Mrs. Crowninshield had was closed in the wintertime. My father, being a contractor, had the job of putting up the shutters and draining the water off and making sure the house was set up for winter. So any other work to be done on the house during the season when it was open was usually done by my father or one of my brothers. It was from my younger brother that I learned a particular memory of his. The house was surrounded by terraces that had pink quarry tile as the paving on them, and pink and white awnings over them. In addition, the plantings around the terrace were also pink. And one particular day when my brother was working there, Mrs. Crowninshield came out in a dress to match the surrounding decor. Mrs. Crownshield's philanthropies to the various organizations to which she belonged, from the museums to the symphony orchestras to the historical societies, are too many to mention here, but I am eternally grateful to her for her discernment and her determination to make the Lee Mansion into what it is today. Also, Mrs. Crowninshield died in 1958 at the age of 81. It's ironic that when she died, none of her heirs wanted the house on Peaches Point, and it was torn down. The gardens are all grown over now, the swimming pool is filled in, and it's rather sad to go by the gates of the house and just see remnants of what it was. The legacy she left to the museums and other organizations to which she was so very generous will live on forever, and I, for one, am extremely grateful to her for the role she played in making the Marblehead Historical Society such an enjoyable place to be.